Välkomna till vår tids tänkare. Jag heter Mattias Hagberg och idag ska vi prata med den bulgariska statsvetaren och Europaexperten Ivan Krastev. Verksam vid Center for Liberal Strategies i Sofia i Bulgarien och vid Institute for Human Science i Wien, Österrike. Och det här samtalet är ett samarrangemang mellan Göteborgs litteraturhus, Folkuniversitetet i Göteborg, bokförlaget Daedalus och tidskriften Ord och bild. Welcome, Mr. Krastev. How are you today?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you with us today. You are in Sofia, and I would like to start asking you, what is the corona situation like in Bulgaria today?
Listen, like most of the Central and East European countries today, Bulgaria is kind of a quite bad situation. If you look at the numbers, the number of people infected, dying, countries like Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, among the countries which fared very badly, even in the European comparisons. On the other side, we're going to have elections this Sunday. So politics and corona are very much mixed these days. And while we have a quite high number of people infected and dying, the regime is not particularly strict. And I do believe one of the reasons the government is not trying to follow very much the German or other models is that psychologically the patience of the public has been exhausted. So I do believe that the motto of the government is never come with a policy that cannot be implemented. So as a result of it, basically, you could expect when you see the numbers that the situation should be much more restrictive, but it is not. Even starting from tomorrow, some of the restaurants and coffee shops who have a garden parts are going to be open. Okay,
so you're not under lockdown?
No, no.
Do you think the corona pandemic has affected or is going to affect the election in Bulgaria?
Listen, it is, but it's not very clear how. And from this point of view, it's quite interesting because obviously the pandemic has intensified certain divides that have been in the country before. But I don't believe that for the moment, position of parties on the pandemic is the one that defines how they're going to be voted. Paradoxically, this 1 year was in Bulgaria kind of a year in which there was a mass protest in the summer, but the opposition was muted. Because in the moment of corona, you have only the government and the pandemic. So I don't know. We don't know how many people are going to vote. So one of the impact can be a quite low turnout. And secondly, we can end up with election results which are very much going to resemble what we saw in Israel last week. Impossibility to form any type of a stable coalition. So from this point of view, I do believe the pandemic much more exposed the problems that Bulgarian politics has before the pandemics than kind of remaking Bulgarian politics.
Okay, thank you. In your book, It's Tomorrow Yet, How the Pandemic Changed Europe, you write that the pandemic is inevitably going to change the world. In what way? And if we start with the global perspective, I think.
Listen, I do believe it's going to be in a different ways. And this is at least my view, which I do believe also is a common sense among many people, that this is not that the pandemics was a disruption. It is not that basically the world turned into a different direction, but the effect of the pandemic is slightly like you have been traveling in certain direction, but with the slow train. Suddenly overnight, you have been moved to a super fast train. And certain type of trends that have been seen before escalated. For example, global supply chains. They were there. And people were quite afraid, and they knew that probably 70% of the production of the 180 key trade products in the world are produced in a single country before the pandemic. So 70% of the facial masks or certain type of medicines, we knew these statistics, we knew that this is quite fragile, but nobody was really so much worried. And then suddenly this came in our face. So one of the things that we see very much is fragmentation. People want to remake this type of a global supply chains. They want to have a production closer home. You suddenly understand that the only medicine that you can get is the medicine that are produced in your own country or on your own continent. This is on one side. And on the other side, suddenly, this was freezing of the movement of people. Imagine, we have been talking and discussing, and migration was such an important issue for the last 5-6 years, and then suddenly overnight, people stopped moving. Goods are moving, but people are staying home. They're even not crossing the street in order to go on the other side of the street. So I do believe this is one thing, and this is the first type of a crisis that the world experienced at the same time. I was surprised to see to what extent the moment we have been closed in our apartments, it opened our mind to the world. People start to compare what is happening to their country to what is happening in other places. So if there was one dictatorship for this 1 year, this was the dictatorship of comparisons. Anything that your government is doing is going to be immediately compared to what others are doing. So from this point of view, I do believe they're going to be this divide. The way we talk about 1989, at least in Eastern Europe, before and after, I do believe we're going to talk about pandemic, before and after.
In what way do you think we are going to talk about it?
Listen, I do believe it's going to be in a different way. Of course, when I said that certain trends that have been there before have been escalated, one of these trends, of course, is a major confrontation between the United States and China, between the West and China. So geopolitically, we are going to see a much more polarized geopolitical space. And I do believe we're going to have quite strong decoupling, particularly when it comes to technology. There are going to be technological walls. At least my feeling is that in 5 or 10 years, the decision what kind of a 5G technology you are using is going to tell you much more about your politics than many other things in the world. So this is a change. So this kind of a much more soft, globalized world in which most of the issues were perceived as commercial issues have been now remade, and we see the world which is much more geopolitically centered. The security perspective is becoming much stronger. And also within the societies, one of the things that shocked everybody, and I was not the only one noticing this, is that while we talk a lot about democracy and authoritarianism, but particularly in the first months of the pandemics, if I'm going to tell you what kind of a policy have been adopted in a certain country, and if it's up to you to decide, is this a democratic country or authoritarian regime, it's not going to be easy for you to come with the right answer. I do believe that the border between democracies and authoritarian regimes was the least guarded border in Europe and in the world in this 1 year.
Okay, if we turn to Europe then, the coronavirus is most lethal to people with underlying sickness. And in your thinking, it's the same thing with Europe and societies. And you write that Europe has a lot of underlying sickness. In what way? What is the problem with EU today?
Listen, it was one of the interesting stories that you hear from people that went through the COVID-19, that basically suffered the sickness, was that at the moment when you feel better, then suddenly you get worse. And this was kind of what shocked me when I was seeing this 1 year, was how over the period of 2 or 3 months, countries that we have been praising of doing very well in dealing with the pandemic suddenly became the biggest losers. So Germany is the recent example. Just 6 months ago, this was kind of the success case in Europe, and now basically there was an article today in Financial Times saying that Germany has become a laughingstock. What are the 3 things that, in my view, very much kind of were exposed by this crisis? Interestingly enough, the pandemic started as a kind of a nationalist moment, and the moment when the virus came, all the borders have been closed, and they were closed everywhere. So Germany closed as quickly as East European countries. Then suddenly over time, I do believe East European societies understood the impossibility of economic nationalism. The moment basically we get close, we understand that we cannot stay close. So the second moment was a much more positive one, in which basically Europe rediscovered the need of a bigger economic space. And I do believe this is how the recovery plan came up. And this was a major breakthrough. But as I told you, in my view, there's 3 things in the European decision-making that were very much exposed. One is a very low-risk culture of European decision-making. Listen, if you see, for example, all the story with banning AstraZeneca for a certain period and opening and so on. Any moment when you have kind of any trouble or sign of trouble, the government pulls. And this type of a zero risk culture, in my view, is totally unsustainable. We are living in the world in which you cannot predict many of the things that are going to happen. You're either taking all these statistical stories serious, and there was no any type of a statistical correlation that should push the government to do what they did. Or I do believe that the governments are going in a very strange game, and they start to basically promise people something that even religion never promised them: immortality. We started basically, and in my view, this was a major dramatic change. What we realized in this 1 year is that for many Europeans, death has become something unnatural. We used to believe that basically the human species we're people who are dying, and in a certain way, we're living our lives facing death. And then suddenly, any type of a death is perceived either as a medical error or as a crime. This unnaturalness of death is very strong in European culture, and in my view, very much affected this low-risk culture that we see. Second is the timing of the decision-making. European Union is a slow animal in a world in which speed is of critical importance. And I find this critically important because if you see now, this is very much also seen with the vaccination. And certainly, some of the best features of the European projects turns to be its major vulnerability. Compare two types of actors, European Union on one side and Israel on the other when it comes to vaccination. European Union, being a very big market, from this point of view, of course, was in a privileged position with respect to the pharmaceutical companies because it's very big. But European decision makers, because Brussels was negotiating on behalf of everybody, and they knew that all the member states are going very closely to look to what they have negotiated, they wanted first to have the best price, secondly, the most transparent proceedings, and thirdly, to keep the privacy of the European patients, so they were not ready either to overpay or to give the data from the state of the patients to the pharmaceutical companies. But as a result of it, now countries like Israel has vaccinated more than 50% of its population, and you see how slow this process goes in Europe. So I do believe this were the three things that really struck me, and this was the type of vulnerability that has been exposed. And we can end up in the autumn, particularly there are going to be new lockdowns in the autumn, in a situation in which many Europeans are going to lose confidence in the European project, but also in their nation states. And this is politically, I do believe it's a major risk.
But do you think the pandemic is going to change the way Europe works or the EU works?
Listen, it's not an easy question because in a certain way, EU is a collection of states, and these states have a different trajectories. And unfortunately, most of the states recently has become very inward-looking. What European states have learned for the last 50 years is that when you cannot redistribute public goods, you can redistribute blames. And while probably the European Commission can easily be criticized for many of the decisions that have been taken, it cannot be criticized for the very slow rollout, even in the places where you have the vaccines. And secondly, in order to show that they care about their own citizens, most of the European member states basically decided to show that they care by breaking European rules. For example, negotiating vaccines that have not been licensed and approved by the European agencies, or doing things like this. And in my view, this is why it's going to be very difficult to go with a radical change. On the other side, economically, what happened in July and the recovery plan is a major breakthrough. I mean, it's an intellectual revolution for places like Germany. In a certain way, Germany has agreed to underwrite the debts of some of the much poor countries. But also what I fear is that if there's going to be a crisis of political confidence, then people are also going to see major inequalities which are going to rise. Because after this crisis, like every crisis in the last 20 years, the wealthy northern countries are becoming even more advanced with comparisons with the South. And while we put a lot of effort to keep certain level of equality and cohesion within societies, trying to privilege the most vulnerable groups, I don't believe that you have the same effort to privilege the most vulnerable states. Even within the EU, I'm even not talking outside of the EU. Because one of the scandals that I see is that this inward lookedness ended up in a situation that countries like North Macedonia, which is just on the border of the EU, they have been asking for 4,000 vaccines just to vaccinate their medical personnel. And they got the vaccines not from any of the EU member states of the European Commission, they got them from Serbia. So we're not talking about Africa, we're not talking about Asia, we're talking about these very small states which are in a process of integration of the EU. This kind of a really very low risk and low ambition, impossibility to try to see outside of your national box, this makes me quite worried about how the autumn is going to look for the European Union. Particularly, and this is for me very important, part of the consolidation of the EU in the last 3 or 4 years was the result of the failure of Brexit. When Europeans were looking at the United Kingdom, they felt very happy that they're in the EU. And then now in the autumn, you're going to end up most probably with the United Kingdom trying to normalize the economy faster because of the number of vaccination. The same was the comparisons with the United States. 6 months ago, the United States was a total disaster. When you see what is happening on the pandemic side, it was just tragic to see the country, which in 2019 was #1 in the index of the country best prepared for pandemics, to be totally destroyed. But now, probably in September and October, both the US market and the US societies can at least hope to be in a post-COVID situation, while many of the EU member states are still going to be in a COVID situation.
But do you think we are heading towards disintegration of Europe, or?
No, listen, I don't believe that anybody is interested to exit the European Union. It's totally different. And this is, I do believe this ended somewhere in 2018, even probably earlier with the French presidential elections, when people understood that promising people to get out of the European Union, you're promising them what? This is a small, medium-sized countries, and particularly if the world goes fragmented and if we're going to see much more protectionism, economic protectionism probably makes certain sense on European level. It does not make any sense on the national level. You should tell me what it means for Bulgaria to get protectionists. You're going to tell me what it means for Bulgaria to be sovereign in a world which is dominated by big powers like China, like the United States, like Russia. So from this point of view, I don't expect countries trying to get out of the European Union. But what I'm afraid is that people less and less see Europe as a project and much more as a resource on which you can rely, you can blame, you can get money from, you can coordinate here and there. But you don't basically see in terms of transformation, a part of the ambition, part of the view that Europe has a special role to play in the world, and for the Europeans, has slightly disappeared. And European Union behaves on one level as a retired power. We are not ready to risk more. And on the other side, basically governments treat it as a pension fund, a very risk kind of economic player where you can go for resources, but this is not a project that is storming the future. Let's put it like this.
In your writing and in your thinking, you often turn to demography, and you often talk about the migration of people in Europe and of the aging population in Eastern Europe as a big problem. Why is that? What is the problem with demography in Europe today?
Listen, even part of the response to the pandemic is related to this. Europe is aging, and by the way, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe is the fastest demographically shrinking part of the world. My own country, Bulgaria, is the fastest demographically shrinking state in human history in the absence of war or major disasters. In 1989, there were around 9 million people living in Bulgaria. There's 7 million people living now, and according to the UN projections, in 2040 we can talk about 5.7 million people. So what has happened, and this is an interesting story, part of it is a positive, part of it is negative. We have a low fertility rate like everywhere in Europe. But the major difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe is that while Western Europe is very much preoccupied with the newcomers, people coming from other parts of Europe, from outside of Europe, at the same time, basically, there is a lot of out-migration in Eastern Europe. For the last 30 years, Eastern Europe has lost 18 million people. If this was a country, this country was going to be as big as the Czech Republic and the Hungary together. Secondly, opening of the borders was the best and the worst that happened to East Europeans after the end of communism. The best because all of us has the possibility to get an education, to work in other places, to see the world. Personally, I'm one of the major beneficiary of this, basically being between Sofia and Vienna. But if you're living in a country, particularly you're an older person in the rural areas and so on, suddenly you're living in villages without kids around. There is not much doctors because many of these doctors went to the West. And what is something that people don't realize is that this major movement of people, and in some countries, we're talking about between 10 and 15% of the population that have left, and 70% of those who have left, for example, in Romania, are younger than 40. As a result of it, 4 important things are happening. One is movement of people is also transfer of money. All the money that have been invested in my education left with me. Secondly, the fact that people are living is changing very much the electoral politics. As you know, the turnout of the diaspora voters is much lower, particularly in countries in which electronic voting is not allowed, voting by mail is not allowed. So when many people are looking to Central Europe and say, oh, what happened with all these liberal voters who voted differently in the 1990s, the story is many of them are in the West. They are not voting anymore. So as a result of it, many of the liberal trends have been paradoxically strengthened by the easiness with which people are living. Thirdly, and this is not unimportant, you have a major generational disbalance. Because of the low fertility rate and because of a high out-migration in the absence of many people basically coming to our countries, the younger generation is not numerous enough. It's a small cohort of people. And this explains why you're going to see a lot of young people protesting on the streets, but you're not going to feel their power in the ballot box because they don't have the power. And fourthly, even some people who did a very good career basically should be very successful with what they have achieved in their own countries. Being successful in a country where most of your friends are just discussing when to leave.
Is there a clear... Sorry.
It does not make you really happy. I'm saying this because from this point of view, pandemic can have one important positive impact. As a result of the pandemic, quite a lot of East Europeans came back to their countries. In the case of Bulgaria, we're talking around 150,000, 200,000 people. And the question is, are they going to find the reasons to stay? Is basically the economy going to give them an opportunity? Because trying to understand that mobility is a two-way street in Europe is one of the things that is really important for Eastern Europe.
Is there a connection between this demographic shift and the populist movement and the nationalist movement in Eastern Europe? Do you think that?
Absolutely, not only in Eastern Europe. After the European elections, there have been several studies showing that the best predicator of which regions are going to vote for the far right is not either incomes or education, but the depopulation in the last 10 years. The people that have been basically the regions from which the highest percent of people have left for the last 10 years tend to vote much more for the far right than anybody else. And also in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, there is one important difference compared with the Western Europe, which in my view is very much overlooked. Imagine the ethnic map of Europe in the year 1900. And you're going to see 2 Europes. One was very multicultural, multi-religious, very diverse. And this was Central Europe. This basically was the Habsburg lands. And there was another which was much more ethnically homogeneous, and this was Western Europe, Germany, Sweden, basically France. Then came the 20th century, and in the 20th century, states were bigger travelers than people. For example, there is a famous story for a peasant who was born in Macedonia in year 1900. And for the next 92 years, he never left his village. But during this period of time, he was a citizen of 5 different states. So states have been traveling even when basically people were staying at home. But as a result of this major travel of people, expulsion of the population, destruction of the population, now if you see the ethnic map of Europe, you're going to see 2 Europes again. One is very multicultural and multi-racial and multi-religious, and this is Western Europe. And the other is very much ethnically homogeneous. And this is Eastern Europe. For example, in 1939, around 1/3 of the population of Poland were not ethnic Poles. There were Germans, there were Jews, there were Ukrainians. In 1991, 95% of the population of Poland were ethnic Poles. So as a result of it, in many of Central and East European countries, ethnic homogeneity was perceived as a major public good. While in Western Europe, because of decolonization, because of 1968 and others, ethnic diversity, at least for the majority of the people, was perceived as kind of a value in itself. And I do believe this divide is very important. Also keep in mind that 9 of the Central and East European states was a colonial power. So we neither have the guilt nor the encounter. So I do believe all these kind of cultural differences are critically important also to explain also the nature of the support for some of the liberal populist parties, East versus West. But I want to end on something different. The biggest divide in Europe, if you're going to see on the opinion polls and the voters' preferences, is not between East and West. It's not between North and South. It is between the urban areas and the rural areas. And this is the same in Western Europe and the same in Eastern Europe. The Bratislava, Warsaw, Prague are much more similar to Stockholm and Berlin than to their own countryside.
So that's the big difference in Europe.
Yeah, this is the big divide, which very much resembles the divide in the United States. So from this point of view, Eastern Europe, from time to time, Central Europe looks like the red states of Europe.
But when we're talking about demography, we also have the migration towards Europe, which of course is on pause right now, but it's going to come back. You speak about migration towards Europe as a kind of revolution. In what way?
Listen, one of the major changes that in a world of a global media where everybody knows how others live, in a world in which basically, even in most of the poorest African villages, people can have an internet on television and they can see how people are living in Stockholm or Berlin or Paris. If you want to change your life, and if you want to do it quickly and in one generation, it makes much more sense to try to change the country than to try to transform your own country. And to be honest, East Europeans were the first to realize this. Why should I stay, basically, and hope that in 20 or 30 years, my country is going to be like Germany, when I can go to Germany tomorrow and start living there? And I'm saying this because paradoxically, the decline of nationalism and the much more cosmopolitan state of mind of many citizens in the world after the end of the Cold War made exit very easy option. In his classical book on exit, voice, and loyalty, German-American sociologist Albert Hirschman was saying that there are certain things that we cannot leave. Our ethnic groups, our countries, our religion, our families. But suddenly, we are now living in a world in which it's very easy to live. And then for many of these people living in poor countries, they want to live. Because the major difference, if you want to basically know how well in material terms your children are going to live, the best predicator is to know where they're born, not the education of their families, even not the wealth of their families. But the best thing that you can do for your children is to basically help them to be born in Sweden or Germany than in other parts of the world. And from this point of view, I do believe that this is the new revolution of the 21st century. Migration is this new revolution, and it is taken by individuals. It does not need political parties. It does not have ideologies. But because of it, and because the West, and particularly Europe, is the major destination point for many people. So in this new revolution, basically Europeans are becoming the counter-revolutionary force, because in a certain way, you understand that you cannot keep your borders open for everybody, and how you decide whom to allow to come and whom not to come. And from this point of view, there is a central contradiction which is very clear in Eastern Europe. This is not true that East Europeans have closed themselves. It's going to be a surprise for you to learn that in the last 3 years before the pandemic, the European Union member states that got most labor migrant was Poland. Almost 2 million Ukrainians. But it's not only Ukrainians, there are 20,000 Pakistanis who went to work in Poland. But the major story is we're ready to open our markets. We're not ready to open basically our political societies. In Eastern Europe, we're not ready to give them voting rights. And this central contradiction in which most of the European documents, when you read, you're going to read that we're open for refugees, but we don't want economic migrants. In a certain way, the truth is just the opposite. Most of the countries are much more open to economic migrants than to refugees, and particularly strong this is in Eastern Europe.
Do you think we tend to miss this, these big demographic shifts that is going on?
I do believe that we are, in a certain way, we are realizing first that we see the major decline of the European population in the world. And now when you see in the world terms, you can see it. In several decades, Europeans are going to be just 6% of the world population. Secondly, living in an aging society, particularly aging society which is a functioning welfare state, is facing people with a very tough dilemma. Do you want to live with people like you, or do you want to live in the way you're living? And I do believe that European societies were starting to face these issues in a much more dramatic way in the last 5-10 years. Don't forget that the pandemic also exposed how old our societies are. It is not by accident that we discovered the number of the people over 80 living because of their vulnerability. We discovered in a certain way the old person nursing houses. And strangely enough, also, I do believe during the pandemic, we all have been living like retired people. I was talking to my mother and I was saying how much, basically, she's 78, how much the pandemic changed her life. And she said, not so much. Anyway, I was staying most of the time at home. I was not seeing more than 4 or 5 persons. I was not traveling much. So strangely enough, we basically have been lived the life of an older person for 1 year, and how to get out of it and how to basically inject certain type of a dynamism in European societies, in my view, is a major story. And the second issue, which for me is a major dividing line between liberal and illiberal version of the world, best can be explained by the story of an Italian restaurant that we want to go to in Vienna. So this restaurant was created like an Italian restaurant, but probably some decade ago, it was bought by an Egyptian business person. And at the present, this restaurant has an Egyptian owner. Neither the cook nor the waiters speak Italian, are Italians, or have ever been in Italy. The music is in Italian, the menu is in Italian, but then the question is this an Italian restaurant? And if you're going to talk to those Austrians or Germans, I can imagine the same for the Swedes, they're going to say for sure, this is an Italian restaurant because the menu is Italian and because basically the music which you hear is the Italian. But if you're going to talk to Bulgarians, Hungarians, and Poles, they say, no, this cannot be a real Italian restaurant. If there is not an Italian there, if there is not an Italian cook, if they never had an Italian grandmother. So from this point of view, what makes a society, Italian or Bulgarian or Hungarian, is very different in these two parts of Europe. And in these, very much the ethnic origins of society is the one that people believe that defines the nature of the political community. So this is, in my view, gives you an idea of where also some of the tensions between East and West could be found.
Our time is almost over, but I have two last questions. If you look ahead, and you look 10 years ahead, what will Europe look like then? It's a hard question, I know, but if you try to predict.
It's a hard question. And this is a hard question because I know that we like to divide people between pessimists and optimists, but there is something common between them. They have the illusion that they know how the world is going to look like. I'm not one of them. I do believe that in the next 1 or 2 years, Europe should make a really serious choices. Either we're going to inject certain dynamism and we should turn to the future with all the risk that comes with this, or Europe is going to be very much a nostalgic place. One of the opinion polls from 2019 that made me very sad was the fact that it was a pan-European poll that was done by one of the big German foundations. The majority of people believed that the life was better before. We're not going to agree when before, but sometime before. So from this point of view, I had the feeling that Europeans started to fear the future. If we don't stop fearing the future, I'll be quite kind of pessimistic of what's going to happen. If we can succeed to fall in love with the future again, because on the other side, even this 1 year, help us quite a lot. For example, this 1 year was the most massive migration I have seen in my life. People migrated from the physical to the virtual world in the way nobody can imagine. Even this type of an interview was never going to take place this way a year ago. So if we find interesting the coming world, I still believe that Europe is very well positioned because, strangely enough, Europe, for many reasons, was a quite experimental society. And then suddenly, somewhere in 70s, because of wealth, because of kind of a self-confidence, we lost an interest in experimentation and we became very conservative in cultural terms. So if we can manage to rediscover the experimental spirit of Europe, and if we basically succeed to fall in love with future again, I do believe in 10 years, Europe still is going to be a very important place. Not the capital of the world, but for sure not the forgotten province.
And if you look further ahead, what will Europe look like? An even harder question.
It's a very hard question because many of the things are not going to depend only on Europe. For example, what is going to happen when we talk about climate? It's not up to the Europeans only to do it. Europe is not going to be the one that is going to frame the nature of the confrontation between the United States and China. And I do believe this is a much more bigger problem that we have seen before. But I do believe Europeans, we should do what depends on us. So I don't want to look in a very, very distant future, because when you're looking in a distant future, you're going to a science fiction story. And to be honest, I never was a great reader of science fiction.
Okay, Mr. Krastev, very pleasure talking to you. Nice to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your invitation.